Welcome to episode 104 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on June 27th, 2023. I have an interview with Samira Hill today, one of the contributing designers of issue 3 of the Journal of Scottish Yarns, who also serves as the tech editor for the journal. We had a great chat, and I'm happy to be sharing it with you. The astute among you may have noticed that I am recording this part of the episode the day after I recorded the intro for the last episode. I'm off on a trip to Normandy with my husband for our 22nd anniversary. The day this airs, we should actually be landing back in the US, so if you'd like to see some photos, please hop over to my Instagram. I think I know myself well enough to know that I'll be posting as we travel. But what this quick recording schedule means is that I don't have a lot to share. I'm pretty sure that there will be some Shetland Hogmanay boxes available still. I increased the number over last year, and the initial rush of orders seems to have passed. At this point, there seems to be just like 1 or 2 purchased every few days. So if that continues, there should still be a few left in the shop. You can see for yourself and get all the details at store.ithoughtIknewhow.com or use the link in the show notes. Another thing that I can update you on for sure is that now that the tickets for Shetland Wool Week have gone live, I have officially got us a booking for a listener dinner on Wednesday, September 27th at 6 p.m. at number 88 on Commercial Street. It will be a very casual event. We're just meeting up for dinner. Everyone will be responsible for their own bill, but we are also limited to 26 people. And after announcing it earlier this evening, a third of those spots are claimed. Please send me an email at ann@ithoughtIknewhow.com if you're interested in joining us, or find the event listed in the I Thought I Knew How Facebook group to claim a spot there. I'll, of course, put links in the show notes. Also, when this goes live, we will be in the thick of the summer yarn make-along with the Journal of Scottish Yarns. For details about that, including information about prizes and how to win them, I'll point you to episode 101 of the podcast and to my Instagram feed or the I Thought I Knew How Facebook group or the community page on Ravelry. But this make-along is how I first heard of my guest today, Samira Hill of Eildon Hill Designs. Samira is multi-talented, designing in both knitting and crochet, and as I mentioned, she also works as a tech editor. She's also an archaeologist and speaks about textiles to various groups. I think that we need to start a campaign to persuade her to offer those talks online for those of us who live too far away to attend in person. After this talk with Samira, I can only imagine how interesting those talks would be. Please enjoy this talk with Samira Hill of Eildon Hill Designs. Samira, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you too.
Thank you. One thing, of course, I always start with the same question, and that is, could you tell us how you got started on your fibercraft journey?
I started actually as a child. It's probably in a way that a lot of people started as well. I think, sort of remember it, I must have been maybe 7 or 8 years old. My mum was a sewer. She worked in a sewing factory for about 22 years. And so at weekends, on Sunday afternoons, after the Sunday lunch, she'd clear the table and then she would sew on this and make me and my sister our Sunday clothes and things. And I think she actually taught me to knit, to get a little bit of peace and quiet, so that I wouldn't bother her while she was at the sewing machine. I never really saw her knit very much. I think if you're someone who sews, the knitting seems really, really, really slow. She could make up garments much quicker. But there was an old basket that always had those knitting needles and those bits of wool that she perhaps had started when I was a baby, don't know. But I never really saw her knit. But that basket was always there. So anyway, she showed me. I think she would cast on for me, and I would just knit like rows and rows of garter stitch, probably full of holes or whatever. And then when I had enough, she would cast it off, and we would make things with it for my dolls or Barbie dolls, or so, mini skirts, boob tubes. They had a lot of these. Made all sorts with those rectangles of knitting. And that was it, really. I do really remember knitting across from her at the table. And then growing up, I was really sporty. So I didn't really do any craft or things. I was just constantly playing sports, various sports. And I didn't go back to knitting at all until I was at uni. And I had a flatmate, or I just finished uni, I had a flatmate from Sweden. And she was knitting. And I just remember just watching her thinking, I know how to do this. I've done this before a long time ago. I've done this before. So I remember she showed me how to cast on, because I didn't know how to get started. Yeah, then I just started, and being an archaeologist was just a great way. Knitting is, you'll find a lot of archaeologists are good knitters or good, crocheters, because you're always on the go. You're always on the move. You have to follow the archaeology. And this was before we had phones with internet or even Wi-Fi and internet signal. You would be away. I would be one side of Scotland for 3 days and then the other side for 2 days, and not knowing where I'll be next week in a completely different place. So there's so many books you can carry with you. You're staying in a wee guest house, or in a hotel, or in a self-catering when you're with a team. So yeah, everyone just sort of has books and things to take with you. Sometimes you're on your own. And as I said, you wouldn't have a TV or anything. So it was great to have knitting with me, because it's also easier to carry than books. So I'm completely self-taught that way. I used to go to a shop, pick up a ball of yarn that I thought looked beautiful, had no idea what it was or thickness or anything, and pick up a book from a charity shop, a knitting book, and just trying to work from little pictures and turning something into a hat, just thinking, oh, well, if I decrease enough here, they'll fit on my head, and just completely worked it out. Made a lot of scarves for a very long time. Gifted them for everyone. And one day my mother-in-law showed me how to, a friend showed me how to purl, and then my mother-in-law showed me how to combine it with knitting, because I just did garter stitch of things, and then I used to do stocking stitch, but I hadn't got the notion of mixing the two to get anything else. And and then I don't know, from that I just started. It's a great therapeutic thing to do after digging. Can be challenging. You're outside all day long, 8 hours a day. You're outside under all weathers, especially in Scotland. So when you come home, you just sort of like want to have a hot shower. You want to be clean. And you come home mucky, so you want to be clean, and put some comfy clothes and put the radio on and do some knitting. So I think the same as when digging, having your hands busy sometimes can just really allow your space to, your head space. And that was me hooked from that. I just did it as a hobby, but just all the time, because a lot of the time there was nothing else to do where I was.
That's quite a journey. Lots of people involved, moving you along from step to step, as you progressed along. That's wonderful. Now you are someone who seems equally comfortable in crochet. When did that become part of your repertoire?
Not so long after learning to knit, really. I was, again, completely self-taught. I actually started wanting to learn to crochet to put borders on my knitting. I sort of used to do blankets and things, and just never liked how the borders looked, or I don't like to do things the hard way. If I can do them in a simpler way, an easier way, that actually works better. So I felt that crochet borders were less convoluted to do than in knitting, and sat really well. And I also really wanted to learn how to make all those 3D sort of shapes that are so much easier to do with crochet than they are to do with knitting. So flowers, roses, just all sort of things that I wanted to put on my knitting. So I literally, again, this is before YouTube, I had this one book I'd picked up, which was the Essentials of Crochet. And again, working from small pictures, just trying to figure out where to put my hook, where does that loop go? I really wished at the time there were classes or something like that near me. And that's probably what spurred me on to becoming a teacher, was the fact that well, not everyone can learn the way that I've learned. And probably, it took me longer to learn all of this. I wish there had been someone that could have taught me this. For some people, it's family. For me, I was just always on the move, couldn't really join any knitting circles or things because I never knew where I was going to be. And it's not the same having people who knit around you. It's not the same as people who will really just teach you or show you. But I went through a phase of making, as presents, making little hot water bottle covers. I would knit them plain and then crochet little flowers, butterflies, little stems, and make a little, stitch them on and make a little landscape of things. So this is really why I started to crochet. And then as I got more confident with my crochet, I then actually started to crochet for the sake of crocheting whole crochet projects, not just to add onto the knitting, just enjoy it just as much as knitting.
That's a fantastic point you make about the lack of YouTube and internet help back in the day, and trying to bless the people who are doing books. And I know it works for some people to have those old line drawings that they used to have, but for me, those made no sense at all. My brain just could not process them.
No. Yeah. And words, even sometimes when you just barely, some books didn't even have the sort of the diagrams. All you've got is, put the loop over and through, and you just like, what? But in a way, it meant that I tried kind of everything and found out what worked and things. So that's why I say when I teach, I tell people, because I'm completely self-taught and I had to get to that point, and whatever mistake you're going to make, I've made it 10 times over, and probably a lot more. So in a way, I think it's a good tool for me to have spent all that time doing that.
So how did you get started teaching?
I started to teach when I sort of needed a break from archaeology. I'd been doing it for, I think, over 10 years, day in, day out. As I said, it can be physically, it's tough. It's hard going, always being on the move. I'm lucky. My husband is also an archaeologist. So we were both freelance and working. Sometimes we worked together. A lot of the time we worked separately. He would be in one part of Scotland, I'd be in a different part. We both lived, we had a flat in Edinburgh. So I think for about a year, at least the first year that we were together, we used to both be away Monday to Friday and both come home on a Friday evening, bring some milk and order some food in for Friday night, because it was just nothing in the flat. It can be hard going, always being away. The weather, can be tough, but we then moved away. We went, traveled around and lived in Australia for a year. And we were away for almost 2 years. And in Australia, we worked as archaeologists with Aboriginal communities, and that was just fantastic experiences. But when we came back was when the recession, was sort of the 2010, 2011 recession had properly kicked in. And as archaeologists, we follow construction, the construction industry quite closely. And that industry had taken a big hit. And a lot of projects that would have been scheduled were suddenly on hold. And a lot of archaeology companies had gone bust. And so everyone was just tendering for projects and were just tendering lower and lower and lower. So it was getting these were very stressful times for digging, because you have no knowledge, or you don't really know what you're going to find. But work, projects that you would have been given 2 weeks to do in the past, you had to do them in 3 days, and probably paid a little bit less than what you would have been paid before. So conditions were harder, and you ended up just not having time to do things, and it was quite stressful. And I think at that stage, you started wishing you were not going to find anything, because you didn't have time to find things. And I think when I found myself being an archaeologist, hoping not to find anything today, I felt I needed a break. It was just getting too stressful, and it was starting to eat in my life. And my husband had just started his own archaeology company. He works in community archaeology, which is very different and more like what we like to do. But he was just starting up, so I needed a break. So I just stopped. I worked I just did a small job in a place near us, but it gave me a lot more time to dedicate then to my hobby. That's sort of what kept me sane, especially after hard days of digging, when I'd finally filled all my trench sheets, and I could then do a little bit of knitting. So then I had a lot more time to do that. So I did a lot more of it. I guess I improved. And then I met Kerry Kimber at the very first Edinburgh Yarn Festival, actually. That would have been 2011 or 2012, I can't remember. It was 10 minutes from the flat. You could walk to a yarn festival. She was just starting what she then developed as a franchise, the Knitting for All company, where she was teaching kids at school, and she'd done a whole methodology and everything, and it really worked. And I went along, I went to a few classes, really enjoyed it. And then when I moved out of Edinburgh, decided to just do that, set up my own business with her methodology and teach. And I did that up until I taught in the schools near me, kids of all ages, mostly primary school age, all the way to COVID, when then we couldn't really get into the schools. But I was teaching adults as well in various workshops and in holiday retreats and things. And I still do that. It's just took a bit too long to get back into schools. And in the meantime, I've taken on other work. I miss the kids a little bit. It was always fun. It's great, the feeling, I just felt a bit of a responsibility to pass on these skills. Because no one had, my mum had taught me, but clearly it's missed a generation. And a lot of parents would bring the kids to my classes just to say, well, Granny used to knit, but I don't know how to. And they want to learn, or they want to. So I'm sort of like filling that gap, really.
How was that structured for the schools? Was that during school time or an after school class, or?
It was both, actually. Some schools had some activities that would change every term. So one term they would do music. So someone would come and they would play the whistle or things for a term. And then another term would be craft. And then I would come in and do some knitting with them for a term. And that was during school hours. But then I also ran them, especially when I did more of these, and then more kids knew about knitting and then wanted to continue after the term. So that's how I started doing more and more after school clubs, where once a week in each school. And I had teachers working for me to get sort of bigger groups, because it's such a hands-on activity. You really need to be there. It was so lovely. The kids just learn, they just really got it. They learned it really well. We always made it fun. They made little puppets and things. We didn't make them do like socks or scarves or anything like that. It was all toys and fun things using huge needles and massive wool, so that, because if they sit down for half an hour and do 3 rows, they really wanted to show. So it would grow. Yes. So, it was lovely. And seeing that connection a lot of them then had with parents or grandparents, because they learned to knit. And sometimes Granny would pick them up from the club and see what, show me what you've done today. And it's really lovely.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm a big fan of trying to get textiles back into the schools, textile work. I think that's very important, because like you said, there was a generation, two generations.
Yeah, almost 2, yeah.
Where a lot of people are just separated from textile creation. And
it's equally, I do agree with that. The one thing also that I find is really important is it being taught properly or in a nice way, because the generation before, I also get a lot of people who said, I learned it at school, and then would never ever touch it because they learned it at school.
Right.
And, they were given teeny needles, a scarf that took forever to make with 40 stitches. And if it wasn't right, they had to rip it right back, and they had to follow the pattern and not diverge from the pattern. I think there's this aspect as well. I find a lot of people were put off by it. That meant that as soon as they didn't need to knit, maybe when the children didn't need clothes or they could afford other clothes, that they were all too happy not to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it needs to be taught, but it also needs to be taught in a really encouraging way and in a fun way, because we do this as a hobby now, really, more than a necessity. So it needs to be fun.
You make a good point. It was a necessity before to have these skills, and now it's more of a cultural preservation, I would say. Almost, there's still an element of self-reliance to it, naturally, but I think a lot of it is that aspect of the culture that's being overlooked.
It's a choice.
Yeah. And so, yeah, you're totally right to have it be an enjoyable cultural fun thing for them to be learning with their friends rather than another thing they're being graded on and it has to be just so. And yeah, for sure.
And I really saw that with a lot of the grandmothers and the kids that I used to teach. And I saw that literally day in, day out. And bless them, they meant really, really well. But this is also the way they were taught.
Right.
And I would see kids, the kids, yeah, their work had holes and it had things, but they loved it. It doesn't matter. It's like when they draw, they tell you that's a car. Okay, that's a car. It doesn't look like a car. It doesn't matter. So they see their knitting in the same way. They think it's amazing. And then they would come back and then we'd all have, Granny took it all back because it was full of mistakes. And re-knitted it. And almost every week, I literally sometimes had to pass little letters to parents. Please do not remember this has to be the work of the children. Please, I know, and they meant well, but it was, and they would say soon the kids would show things like, oh, there's a mistake there, and I was just like, but I can see this is how they've been taught. This is really how they've been taught.
And I will say, just observing on my end as a student, I think my favorite teachers that I've learned from have been people who have taught children how to knit or crochet or whatever. I think that you have seen more. I think you have more patience. I think you give clearer explanations on how to do things. I think it's a wonderful background for someone who wants to get into teaching adults would be to go volunteer at the school or at the library to teach children how to knit. And I think it ends up being a good experience for the teacher too, because they do get so excited about it. They're happy to do it. And if they make a mistake, you can sort of be like, oh, I should explain that better next time. And you can learn along the way. But I think that it is the best background for knitting teachers is to have started with kids.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the idea was that you also start to get, because I always go with any technique or any ways of holding something, it's just, there's no right or wrong way, or there's so many different ways, and it's so personal, and you pick the method that works for you. But equally, also having taught kids of things, you start filtering and selecting the method that seems to be the most successful. So the way I go is, if that works for kids, it'll work for adults. so it sort of like helped me narrow a few techniques that I just find people tend to grasp this faster if I show it this way. It doesn't mean that this is the best way, but maybe when you're a complete beginner in something, this will actually really help you. And I think teaching kids is really what's made that happen, because I had to narrow it to easy ways of doing things. I used to show them how to cast on. It was like the knitted cast on, simply so that they can then move very quickly from having cast on to knitting and not relearn something completely different. And time and time and time again, I got people say, why are you showing them that cast on? It's a harder cast on. They can just use the thumb, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but now you're teaching them two different things. By the time they've cast on, it's like, oh, you just changed this little thing at the end and now you're knitting. And that's it. And you learn all of these things. You sort of, my friend Kerry was really good at establishing some of it. And then I sort of showed what worked and things. And yes, I kind of miss the kids a little. We used to call the stitches like all sorts of different names. We had the ghost stitch. We had the ghost stitches, the ones that sort of like appear and disappear. And then we had the uninvited stitches. The ones we have to say goodbye to. And the drop stitches, they had gone on holiday. We had to pick them back. And one thing that I did very quickly with kids was always to show them how to pick their stitches back when they dropped, because otherwise they would constantly need me, because they do drop their needles, they drop their stitches. And the same way as I teach adults, it's all about teaching them to be independent. You're just there to show them the journey, but they shouldn't need you forever. You want them to be independent and be able to go on their own. So as soon as they'd learned to knit, I'd showed them. We did the taxi and come and pick up all the stitches one by one, and and then they're confident. They don't go Nina for everything. And
that's fantastic. So eventually you got into designing too. When did that start happening? Well, actually, I mean, it sounds like you were really with your knitting, you were just sort of designing from the go.
Yeah, yeah. Because I wasn't following patterns or anything. I did help Kerry. We sort of designed a lot of the patterns for the, for the children and things. Because when you use it as a business, you cannot use someone else's patterns. So we designed all the patterns that we used for teaching. And I've always had a drawer in my head full of ideas, but just no time for it. So actually, when COVID came and I couldn't teach, schools were closed, and I tried it on Zoom, but it just didn't really work with the kids. It's really a hands-on activity, especially with the children. It then just gave me time to actually sit down and work out all these designs that I had in my head, and write the patterns in a way that I know that is clear and that will work. Having done this worked through other patterns and written the patterns for teaching for a long time. In a way, having written patterns specifically for teaching was really good to then write patterns for selling, because in the patterns that you write for teaching, you give extra information. From doing the courses, when I'm teaching socks or things, I know the questions people are going to have. Go, oh, hang on now, where am I? Or how do I know where I am in my round? So the patterns will say, when your tail is here, that means you have done this. Or so the teaching patterns were always like that. So obviously my patterns are now not as detailed unless they're for teaching. But I think it really showed me what was important in a pattern and how to make it clear, because people bring patterns to me all the time and they don't understand. I can see where they're stuck. So all of that was really helpful. But the irony is that I'm now, I'm a pattern writer for big knitwear companies and I never followed patterns when I started knitting. I actually did not know, to be 100% honest, I did not know that, because that's the kind of thing you would have been taught at school. I didn't know that you were supposed to go to a wool shop and look through the patterns, find something that you liked, and then buy the wool for it. I just went through the shop and looked at the wool and picked up a ball or two that I liked. No notion of quantity, no notion of sort of thickness, just thinking, well, that'll knit up quickly, or well, that'll keep me nice and warm. No notion of different fibers or anything like that. Really going for the color.
I was like that for a very long time, because my mom did try and teach me how to knit when I was 8 or 9. It didn't stick. I couldn't figure out what was happening. My brain just wasn't ready for it. And so she taught me to crochet instead. And with crochet, I found, it's just so easy. If you make a mistake, you can just rip
Absolutely.
And start over, and you don't have to worry about things dropping or anything. So I found it to be a very freeing craft, to just be like, what will I try next? And so playing with shapes and things like that was very fun. And so I was the same way. I would go get yarn that I thought was pretty and then come home and make it into something crocheting. And I would use patterns sometimes, but it was a fun way to function for a while there.
No, it is. It's such a free thing. And the notion of that particular notion of crochet, of being free, is I think what makes crochet more appealing to younger people, or to people who haven't knitted or crochet but fancy making something with wool. I really saw that after COVID, because I was also, my friend had a wool shop and she went on maternity leave, and I sort of covered for her. And that was like 2021 or late 2020. And a lot of younger people would come to the shop and said, oh, I learned to crochet during COVID. And it's because you're free. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake. You feel less pressure, I think. So if you've never worked with wool before, it's a lot less daunting to do crochet, I think, than knitting. You don't need as many tools or implements. All you need is crochet hooks, and then you can knit. Right. You can crochet flat in the round. You can do anything with the same hook. So there's that as well, rather than the language of using DPNs and the length of your needles and all of that. I think there's that appeal. I can really see that.
You've mentioned that you're an archaeologist. I saw on your website that you have done talks as an archaeologist about Scottish textiles. What sort of topics do you end up covering in those talks?
The talks that I've done sort of locally, I'm doing a couple of these next month. It is really, for me, the most important part, well, of archaeology and of history and of knitting. It's the constant evolution of it, never seeing it as just the one snapshot that we are seeing. Mm-hmm. And I think people really either forget or are not aware of the fact that when they're seeing, for example, a Roman site, they're seeing it and they think this is how it always was. Right. But actually, this is how it was at the time that it was left and how we uncovered it. It doesn't mean that it was like that 20 years before, or, you know, I tell people when we do community archaeology, when my husband mostly does this and I help him when I can, and showing people that it was always evolving. Think of your house, the short amount of time that you spent in your house, you've probably made modifications. It's probably, sometimes it might not even be at all like what it was when you bought it or when you moved in. In 15, 20 years or more, you've made a lot of modifications to it. And so will the next person coming in and the next person coming in. And what we uncover is only one snapshot of one phase of this entire occupation. So it's sort of bringing this back to people, the fact that it has actually evolved from something and still evolving to something. And knitting is the same. I really sort of see that as when I show people what we used to find, what artifacts are found for textile manufacturing, like spinning tools, and from the Neolithic all the way to the medieval, spindle whorls were used. They were used from the Neolithic all the way to medieval times, because if they were good during the Neolithic time, they were still good. In the 13th century, people were still using them and in all sorts of materials. And then they were personalizing them, or they were like, the textile industry has evolved, but so have the tools. Then the muckle wheel came on and spinning wheels came on, and then we're starting to find less spinning whorls in the archaeological record. And you get more from the historical record of how knitting has also evolved from textile, manipulating textile, whether it was weaving, cloth making, needle binding, and what we pretty much assume from needle binding went into knitting. And especially with the Vikings in Scotland anyway, with the Vikings coming on and bringing the needle binding techniques over, bringing more sheep over, and sheep that were selected for the type of fleeces that they carried. And it just constantly evolved. And then even the knitting styles evolved. You mentioned Shetland. If you think of how knitting went from producing hosiery to then trying to attract the ship and trying to be different and attract different trade, and Unst being quite far, had to make sure that the ship would still come and land there and trade there. So they started spinning the really fine fibers and started doing lace. Fair Isle had started doing those bright colors. It's almost they started diversifying to just make sure they'd get the trade. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but there's this sort of connection of evolving either because of the landscape or the political, social, economics of a period. So it's about that, how we can see that in the record, archaeologically, historically, and still now.
You're also a tech editor for other people's patterns. How did you get started with that? As someone who didn't use patterns.
Yes, I know. That's what I said. That's what I said. It was so ironic. I was helping, in writing the patterns for teaching. Right. And during COVID, when I couldn't write, I also got approached by someone I knew. A big knitwear company was looking for pattern writers and pattern checkers. So I started with them, doing some collections with them, and clearly it went well. So then a lot of people don't sort of realize that those big names and big famous designers don't necessarily write the patterns. They just produce a sketch and a swatch, and then you have ghost writers like me who'll come and do so I get I just get a sketch with measurements for like one size and just and a swatch. And I then produce the whole knitting pattern in like, 7 to 10 sizes, depending on who I'm working for. And before that goes to sample knitters and sample shoot, and then they'll go into a photo shoot and things. So some collections are right, other collections I check, because obviously you don't check your own collections. So sometimes I check someone else's collections, and then you go back and you just do all the math, all the wording in the style of the company that this collection is for. So as I got into that really since 2020, then when I started designing for Susan, and she needed a tech editor because the person who was there got a different job and that kind of thing. So that's how I got on to tech edit yarns. But I've obviously been doing that for other companies, and I do tech edit for some designers just like me who just design their own. Because what I really try to do in my own designs is to help independent yarn producers to sell wool. That's kind of why I started Eildon Hills Designs, was really to bridge and help the independent yarn producers, because I'm sure you've been there yourself. You go to fairs and there's like all this beautiful wool, and you buy a little bit of that and a little bit of that and a little bit of that, and you're not necessarily thinking, well, I don't know what I'm going to make with that, but I just love it. It looks beautiful. But some people specifically need a project to make with that wool. I remember my mother-in-law would be like, I don't know what to do with that wool if I don't have a pattern. So my idea was to try to bridge that, because a lot of big knitwear companies, have pattern books and collections, but yourself, independent yarn producers just don't. They sell the yarn, or they might try to advise on someone else's pattern, but with copyrights, obviously, which is you cannot necessarily pass this on. So I sort of wanted to be an independent designer, but using these independent yarn producers' yarns, so that they then have the patterns and they can go to shows and they'll have kits ready. The pattern is there, and that's sort of like how we have these collabs, which is great because I got to meet so many people, so many lovely people, and then it was just great. Like, people would start contacting me and said, if I send you the yarn, could you make a pattern? I'm often asked for a hat. Could you create a hat pattern? And we'd talk, and I'd see, and they'd tell me the inspiration behind the colorway that they've created, and I'd try to put that into the design, but together with what this colorway inspired me to make. So it's like a full collaboration at the end of it. It's not just my idea of the design, it's also to do with the color and why they've made this yarn. So this is really how I sort of started working with independent designers, and then that's sort of my creativity a little bit. So working with yarns, the journal as the tech editor, so I've got a design in it, but I'm also then tech editing everyone else. It's just simply because I've got the knowledge of, I think if you can write all of these patterns from scratch and grade them, and then you can absolutely check them, deconstruct them, put them into a different style or more user-friendly, more inclusive. Because I love the mission of the journal. I was lucky that Susan approached me very early on in a cafe, I think, approached me to say that I think she needed a designer for crochet, actually, someone in Scotland that could make crochet designs. And we got on really well, and she was very hesitant about the project, and I was all like, just go for it, just go for it. and I'm glad she did. I've been on board with the idea and what she's trying to do from the start. So it's great to be even more involved in it and fully supporting it and helping it, really do well. I think it's fantastic. And I know you're a fan. So I'm really proud of working. I only work on the patterns. I have no input in the articles or things. It's all Susan's. But tech editing, that's how I've arrived at tech editing on the journal. And someone asked me earlier today, designers said, so how did you which course did you do? And I said, actually, I didn't do a course in tech editing, so maybe some people will cringe at this. But I think there's two kinds of people. You could be like me, you can be self-taught and things, but I think I can do a lot of things that some people might not have learned when they do just a tech editing course. So because I've learned to write these patterns from complete scratch, whatever style they are, whatever construction, I've had to completely learn that and make all the mistakes that were in the world to make. You know, when you've got to write a top-down raglan cardigan in 9 sizes from a sketch, I think I'm okay tech editing a written pattern. I can see what's not going to work. I can see if that armhole is not going to work in that size. It needs to be deeper or that kind of thing. That's allowed me to do that. So yeah, I don't really feel the imposter syndrome of not having done a course, but yeah, I am tech editing, but I don't have the qualification.
Oh, you're overqualified. You could go in and teach the tech editing classes, I'm sure.
I do teach a little bit of pattern writing near me. I've actually been approached by the local guild of spinners, weavers and dyers. You must have come across, they've got them in Shetland as well. They're sort of like a nationwide. Have you got something like this?
Yes, different cities will have, or regions will have guilds as well.
So I've been approached because, again, these ladies, they spin, they either have their own fleeces or they get fleeces from someone or they buy them, they spin them, and then it's about teaching them how to make a garment from it. So how to actually write a pattern, not a pattern for other people, but just something that they can then work from that will actually fit. That's something that I sort of do locally. So.
As a tech editor, is there something that you wish designers knew or understood that would make your job a little easier?
To be fair, most designers are really, really lovely. I think maybe sometimes, I don't know, there's just also, some people are so creative, which is wonderful. But I think I almost feel sometimes I'm bringing them down to earth a little bit. So like, that's great, but we can't really do that, and that's not going to work that way, because the knitting won't do that. They're like, oh, I was trying to have this big color rolling, and it's like, but then if you increase that way, it's not going to do that, or you need to, we would need to do this in a different way. There's a little bit of that. Or all I would say is, if you're a designer and you want to really be open at your pattern needing changed or altered, or I think that's probably maybe the hardest, is when we're all protective, and you do get designers who'll say, here's my pattern, it's perfect, nothing needs changed, and I think that's probably the hardest part, is to say, actually it does, and sometimes it's actually some of the patterns that need altered the most. And yeah, just trying to put that message across, or sometimes just putting more inclusivity into a pattern, or just, if you're a designer, don't be too specific onto, like, some people write the patterns as the only way that they would do it, or they would knit it. And really trying to promote designs to be inclusive, user-friendly. You just have to remember not everyone knits the same way. Some people might prefer a particular technique, and it's not the same way that you've done it. But for the message of the journal, that's really what we're trying to convey. So I think it's, part of my work is to be very diplomatic and say, don't take offense. I've just rearranged this. I've just recalculated that. All right. But most of the time it's fine. But yeah, all I would say is just be prepared and be very open to someone else's advice, because this is what you come to Tech Editor for. Don't be offended
or defensive. It's okay.
Just
do your job.
No, absolutely. And we all want, ultimately what we want is the pattern to be nice, clear, and as I said, user-friendly. And that's really what's important to me. Having gone through the teaching, and the learning, I feel I've got quite a good grasp of what's important in a pattern without overloading it, but equally just being clear. And terminology. I think maybe one of my pet peeves is just seeing patterns that will use strange terms or strange names. And I'm like, this is why we've got terminology. This is why we've got standards. It happens mostly in crochet. You'll come across I came across a pattern just a few weeks ago that was talking about pillars. They meant trebles or US double crochet. I know, but they call them pillars. And I'm like, okay, I can see what they mean, but this has got a name.
Right.
And that name is important because it means everyone can follow this. So it's just, it's that kind of thing. It does annoy me when there are standards or terminology out there and they're not used in the pattern because it's not user friendly to everyone.
As you said, you have been involved with the journal from the beginning as the tech editor, but also as a designer. So in the first issue, you have a lovely crochet vest.
But all I'll say is I've been involved from issue 1 as a designer, but as a tech editor only from issue 2.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we call that one a top because it's summary, and you can have it over a dress or you can have it over a really small top underneath.
And then in the second one, you have 2 patterns. You have the Eldon Woods jumper, which is a fully crocheted jumper with raised crochet around the yoke and the sleeves and the opening of the bottom, which is just beautiful. I think crochet jumpers have gotten a bad rap in the past because people use the wrong kind of yarn to make them wearable. Like when I was pretty involved with crochet in the 2000s, the early 2000s. And there was a big push at that point to get people to stop crocheting with worsted weight yarn because everything just ended up just stiff,
heavy and dense.
And there was a big push to get people to use fingering, lace weight, DK for outfits. Like, let's be realistic. Let's be smart about our crochet. And when you do that, you do end up with things that are much more wearable. And so I think crochet's gotten a bad rap for a long time as a wearable craft because of it. So the Eldon Woods jumper calls for DK. And then you have a beautiful knit shawl. Is it Bemerside? Is that how you would say
Bemerside, yeah. Bemerside.
Oh my gosh, this shawl is just gorgeous. It's like rows of vines down the shawl and just absolutely gorgeous. I wish it was an octopus sometimes and had 8 arms so I can have
don't we all? Yeah.
3 projects working at a time. And then for this one, now this one has an accent mark over the E. I'm not sure how to say it properly. Do you want to say it for me?
I think it's Liana.
Is it just Liana? Okay.
I think so. Susan chose the name for me.
Did you?
I just couldn't, I don't know. I just couldn't come up with the name, and she chose the name and I really liked it.
It can be really hard too, because sometimes you think you have a great name and then you poke around a bit and you find out there's like 12 other projects.
Well, that's kind of what my original names were for, and then it became a bit just because of that, and then at the end she chose it, and I absolutely loved it.
It's such a gorgeous project too. So it's color brioche and a triangular shape brioche shawl, just stunning.
Thank you.
But it is brioche with shaping.
Mm-hmm. I really like, I design in all sorts, but brioche is probably one of my little favorite techniques that I really like. I teach that online as well. And I think over the summer I'm doing a brioche school, but I think it's one that people think is a lot harder than it is. And I have written this pattern for people to really just have a go at it. You can get beautiful results in brioche without it being difficult. Susan was exactly like you. She was like, I've not really done brioche before, but I'll give it a go, because Susan knits all the way it works with yarns is the designers knit one sample as they write the pattern up, and then Susan and her sister Carol, they sort of share the sample knitting. They'll make the second sample, and that's the way of testing the pattern as well. And showing how it works with different colors and different yarns. She did it so quick. she was sending me photos. I'm like, have you done this already? And she's like, yeah, because it is the same motif repeated over and over. Yeah, it's a little bit like Bemerside shawl. It looks complex because it's all this lace, but it is exactly the same motif, like 10 stitches, 6 rows or something like that, repeated over and over. It's the placement of it that makes that makes it look intricate. And so it is literally just brioche and an increase to the right and an increase to the left. Once you know how to make these two, that's it. Bob's your uncle, you're good to go. If anyone wants to give it a go, it would be great. And I'd love to answer questions or things. But really with brioche, don't be afraid. It's a bit of a myth. Everyone can do it. And I think people forget they've actually been shown that when was it a couple of years ago? One of Stephen West's shawls had brioche in it, and everyone did it, no bother. But they wouldn't have picked up a brioche project before. But because that was I think it was a mystery knit along, and so they had no choice. There was a whole section in brioche, but then they all did it, and they all did it fine. I didn't see anyone sort of struggling in that section.
I will say, looking at the pattern here on my other screen, there is a chart, which I think makes it a lot easier to follow too once you have a chart down. Okay, so if it's just a short repeat.
Yes, you can see the chart. If you see the chart, that's what the repeat is. That's literally what it is.
That's doable. Okay.
That's why I sort of made it. I have on, in my website and things, I have more intricate brioche designs, but I really did this one because I thought it was pretty, but two, because I wanted to keep it interesting, but also really accessible.
Well, it's the full page photo of the woman on page 107 who has it all wrapped around. That I'm just like, I want that.
And brioche is so cozy. It's got that bounce. It's very, very, very cozy.
It has, you're trapping a lot of air in brioche. It's very squishy. So, yeah. Okay. I'm 95% convinced. We'll see. I do have my projects picked for the make along.
Yeah, no, but there's a lot of choice. And the designs are beautiful. But just to say it out there, if anyone would like to make it but is afraid to make it, then don't be.
Don't be. That's right. And we will have, so Samira's going to come on an Instagram live after this podcast goes up. So if you have questions for Samira, feel free to send them to Anne at IthoughtIKnewHow.com, Anne with an E. And I will ask them then. So if you want any brioche tips or advice for the Leanne shawl, then just let us know. But yeah, you are right. Susan did say she just followed the instructions and it was fine. And
yeah, I was amazed at how quick she got at it. But it's because, like I said, it's a short repeat. So once she got the hang of it, it was just a matter of repeating that.
Don't be a scaredy cat like I am. Give it a go. So will you be doing the make along as well, Samira?
I really wish I had the time. I think I'll make it, but like a year later. Could there be a delayed make along or a belated make along for people like me who don't have time to do them when they're live? I am busy at the moment. As well as starting to tech edit. At the moment, I'm helping the designers. We're already working on HU4, so all the designers are busy at the moment, and I'm supporting them through questions that they have, writing their patterns. We're reviewing schematics and all sorts, as well as me needing to work on my design for issue 4.
Okay, we'll give you a pass on this then, on this one. Yeah, sometimes there's so many fun things you want to be involved in, but you have to think about the demand.
And I'm designing also in the middle of that. I'm also designing a blanket. I've never designed a blanket. I'm designing a crochet blanket for a yarn producer for Bow Fiddle Yarns. You might have seen her. She's up in Aberdeenshire. Yeah, that needs to be done also over the summer. And as I'm working on it, I'm just like, yeah, I really didn't factor enough time for a blanket. What am I? The amount of frogging for this blanket to work is a bit ridiculous. So I'm doing this as well as doing everything else. So because all of this needs to be done by the end of the summer, it'll literally be by the time the make along ends. Sadly, I would probably have more time in September. That's what I mean. I would, we need to do it later. But yeah, the next 2 months are going to be some serious crochet. It's all crochet. Some serious crocheting going on.
So you have a crochet blanket that will come out, I assume, through Bow Fiddle Yarns.
Yes, and it'll be on Eildon Hills Designs as well.
Okay. So people can find it there, and I'll put a link to Bow Fiddle Yarns as well. They're lovely, as well as your website. And then you'll be involved with issue 4 of the Journal of Scottish Yarns. Is there anything else you would like to give people a heads up about that you have in the works, or is there anywhere else people can find you online so that they can follow what you're doing?
Yeah, they can. Well, if you want to see what I'm working on or things like that, or things that I share that are happening in the knitting world, sometimes find me on Instagram, Eildon Hills Designs, and on my website. My designs are also on Ravelry, which you can get to from my website. And I'm also, with all of this, I'm also busy preparing for our next sort of fiber craft fair that I do with my friend called Tangled Galashiels.
Didn't even get to talk about Tangled Galashiels. I wanted to talk about that too. Please tell us about that before we go, because I'm so impressed with this. So Tangled Galashiels, how did that get started? How did you get started with that? And then how did it go this year?
So I live in the Scottish borders, which is just sort of south of Edinburgh. And up until 2018, I think, we used to have the St. Abbs Wool Festival. We used to have a wool festival. And then the lady organising it sort of moved on. And I felt we'd lost something with having lost our yarn. And it wasn't just yarn, it was fibre really, but it was mostly yarns. And Galashiels, near to where I live, used to be really at the heart of textile production of the knitting industry in the borders. The borders have always been famous for the textile heritage. So me and my friend, who had a wool shop then, were really just had the idea of, bringing something back to the borders, but putting it into Galashiels, bringing it back to where it was. And we literally started looking into that just before COVID. Thank goodness we hadn't actually gone ahead with things. So yeah, and then she had a baby. We had to wait a little bit. So there you go, 2023, 2nd and 3rd of June 2023, we just held the first show, which was sold out. We couldn't believe the support that we got, and yes, I think it was very successful. I don't call it a wool or a yarn festival because it's really all about fibers. We have weavers, we have people who are doing felting, different kinds of felting. We have people who are working with tweed, sewing with tweed. We have people who are working with embroidering with wool. Yes, we've got like local sort of community interest companies that are also using textiles to have brilliant projects to work with kids or to work with youth, or just for a lot of therapeutical ends or vocational courses. So we had all of this going on. So we call it a fiber festival. And yes, so it just happened. And I think it was so successful that we hadn't said whether we were going to do another one. Everyone was already asking us before we did it, is this going to be on next year? I can't come this year. Is this going to be on? We were like, well, let's see first how we get on, and if we like it. And yes, everyone was just asking us through the whole weekend, will you do this again? Will you do this again? And at first we're like, well, we'll see. By the end, I think by the middle of day 2, Naomi, my friend, was like, yeah. So it's like, okay, well, we better do this now. So yes, so we are organizing this already behind the scenes.
That's fantastic. So are there classes that go on? Is it a marketplace? Are there speakers?
A bit of everything. There is a marketplace. There is also a place nearby where we host demonstrations, exhibitions. The Guild was doing the Guild of Spinners and Weavers were demonstrating. We might have some embroidery demonstrations next year, not quite sure yet. We had an exhibition by the University of Textile and Fashion, who is also in Edinburgh. So the students did an exhibition of their work for the year, which was really fantastic, using wool. We've got some, the North Ronaldsay Breed Fellowship. We're lucky, there was a flock of North Ronaldsay sheep in the borders.
Oh, wow.
I know there's only, I think, about 10 flocks on mainland UK, and there's one in the Borders. So we have people there who are part of the fellowship to sort of support the breed and of rare Scottish breeds. So we've got these demonstrations, and we also held workshops. We had embroidery, needle felting, boro stitching, and quite a few workshops going on at the tapestry building, at the Great Tapestry building, which I think you haven't seen yet. So you'll have to come down and see it.
No, I haven't been to the Borders area at all. And I really regret that. Like, I really want to.
It's beautiful. You'll enjoy it when you get there.
And this festival has boosted it up my list too, of places to go. So thank you.
Well, that's what it's for. It's really to open up. And a lot of people, that was one of the messages we got as well. A lot of people who maybe live in Edinburgh or things just don't really come down to the Borders. The Borders historically has always been a bit of a sort of a passage. People are just passing through to get to England, or to get to Newcastle, or to get to Scotland and in Edinburgh, and just pass through. And it is such a rich area, and it's such beautiful heritage, landscape, and stories.
And there's so much wool and textile stuff going on there, as you said. You're like my third reason to go there at this point, and they just keep adding to the pile. So like, I just need to go.
We'll do a grand tour when you go there. We'll do a grand tour of the Borders, and I can show you great places and hot spots of wool and textile. There's so much to offer. It's a great area.
That would be fantastic. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for telling us about the festival at the very end, last minute.
No, I also forget all of the stuff I do, and I'm like, oh, hang on. Oh yeah, and I'm working on that as well.
This other thing. It was a real joy to meet you, Samira. Thank you so much.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you again, Samira, for taking the time to chat with me the other day. You can find links to Samira's website and all the other ways to find her online in the show notes. If all goes to plan, I will be back next week with an interview with Ronnie the Woolchemist and Alison Main, the dyer and designer duo who brought us the Roebuck shawl in issue 3 of the Journal of Scottish Yarn. Until then, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. The show notes are where you will find links to all the things mentioned in this episode, so be sure to check those out. Find me on my social media accounts as I Thought I Knew How, except on Twitter, where it's just Thought I Knew How. The groups on various platforms are all called I Thought I Knew How Podcast. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.